All day today, I've got to watch tech founders complain and whine all over the internet. Why are people being so mean to us? We need the free money, or else the whole economy will collapse. It's not a bailout, it's a backstop. Stop being so mean. No, we're not gonna stop being mean. Founders? We're not. Because tech made a promise to us 20 years ago. The promise was a future where all of us would have to work less, where we would have automation for all of these different things, where we could all live and into a utopia brought to us by Silicon Valley. And what do we end up with instead? We ended up in a world with no more entry-level positions that you can climb from. Remember the mailroom? Remember how hearing everyone started in the mailroom and then they became CEO after 25 years? Mailrooms don't exist anymore. It's been replaced with email, with Teams, with Skype, with all the other fucking apps and chats that you can do. Being a cashier is a hell job now. It used to be you just dealt with one customer. You dealt with one register. Now cashiers, thanks to tech, have to handle 6 to 10 registers at the same time, running back and forth, helping people with coupons. And then an old lady over here who still doesn't understand how fucking Apple Pay works. Why did we give old people Apple Pay? And all these tech companies have done the same thing. They figured out how to monetize us. That's all they did. They turned our cars into taxis. They turned our homes into hotels. And they turned our hobbies into passive income streams. We used to make things and go to conventions and meet people to sell them. Now we sit at home, go on Etsy and knit scarves and wait for nice little emails and messages from people as they send us money through Stripe, and we lose out on merchant fees. All the tech industry has done is slowly turn all of us into independent contractors. And in return, they've handed us all a little black box that we put in our pocket and walk around with all day that tracks us so it can get more data to make more ads that they can then put into feeds full of fear-mongering content that will keep us engaged on the app so they can get higher advertiser dollars. All of the apps do this. And then they take that money that they make and they turn it around and go to Congress and they stand in the halls of power and they make sure that they cut the tax laws, that they cut the employment, that they cut all the other bullshit out, that they can stay just above us. So yes, tech founders, I am gonna keep making fun of you because your tower of White Claws has crumbled. And if you want us to stop mocking you, get a real fucking job.
Welcome to Seen and Heard podcast, where everyone should be seen and heard. And my co-host tonight, Charles. Hello, welcome. What are your thoughts on the other side
I
of
was
that?
I was in Silicon Valley, before and during the dot-com bubble. So in the late 90s, early 2000s, I was in Silicon Valley. And I remember the feeling of elation at that time that tech was going to save the world. And the discourse at that time was, this is the new, this is new capitalism. This is going to be the good kind of capitalism. We're not out here like coal factory power plants. We're not weapons manufacturers. We're not, enslaving people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And I remember my friend worked at AMD, which is one of two chip makers. There's Intel and AMD, right? Advanced Micro Devices. Mm-hmm. And I remember him telling us, he's like, hey, when you come by my camp, that they call them campuses, by the way, which again, it's, everyone else has, it works at a company, but in Silicon Valley, you work at a campus, kind of like you're in school still.
Was it like a little town, almost? Like a work town?
I think that was the idea, because this was the time where, we put in break rooms with unlimited snacks and like pool, where you can play pool and video games, but you're also working 100 hours a week. There isn't any overtime. And then also, so he said, when you come, he's like, how there's that huge field? He's like, that's a Superfund site. it's one of the most polluted places in the country. So one of the things was, we're not these big polluters, and it turns out making computers is one of the most toxic things there is.
Mm.
And then that's when we started hearing about e-waste, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you can't just throw your computer in the garbage, right? And then we can talk about planned obsolescence, and that it, in other words, they were promising a new kind of capitalism, and it looks hauntingly fucking familiar.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But it was the idea that, well, being in Silicon Valley, being in the Bay Area of California, it was, the people there are much more progressive, which they were. They were a lot more who's like a notorious white supremacist family. We're the kindler, gentler capitalism. I remember the euphoria at the time, but I also remember the pushback at the time because I was still an activist already. And we were all pointing out what I'm pointing out to you now, that we're like, no, all that glitters is not gold. This is nothing new. This is just the liberal face of capitalism, and something that they introduced at that time sociologically that was different was the idea of peaks and valleys. So in a company, you build up to a big event, a release, and then you release the product and you get to rest, and then it does it again. It goes like that, right? Silicon Valley is so fast, all you have are peaks. There's no slowdown, letdown. So the work culture is now permeated everywhere. Now, if you have a white collar job, you're pretty much expected to work 100 hours. You're chasing deadline after deadline, and they talked about how the workplace had gotten so acute that it reached the point where you're like, okay, I have 7 minutes before the next meeting. Okay, I can probably answer this many emails. I mean, we've never been under that level of acute scrutiny and acute intensity. And so sociologists were studying at the time, and they were finding that it was a level of stress that we were just not used to as workers. So again, all these innovations that supposedly they were supposed to bring, a lot of them were innovations in terms of worker exploitation. And the pizza party mentality.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to give you a raise, but we'll give you a pizza
party.
Right. We're not going to pay you for overtime, but we will give you a pool room with old school video games,
with the bed in the corner
and comfortable couches. Yeah, and comfortable couches you can nap on because you're sleep deprived because you practically live here. Mm-hmm. So and as many snacks as you can eat, which again, feeding a bunch of junk food. I remember the euphoria, and I said at the time, this is just going to be hubris. And now look, we're reaping it, And then of course, now we're talking about the coltan trade, which coltan is that rare mineral that every cell phone needs, and the level of genocide that's going on in Africa to try and mine it. It reminds me of the diamond market. It reminds me of we talked about blood diamonds. Right. We should be talking about blood chocolate. There's Nestle. All these industries that, sure. And
just like in Elon. So that brings me to Elon as well. Like you were talking about how the work culture was in Silicon Valley. He's trying to bring back building company towns like they had in the early 1900s. Company towns where he calls a utopia.
And just so you know, Elon Musk's SpaceX is here in LA, and I know someone who was considering working for him, and their turnover rate is, you barely make it a year. Mm-hmm. They pay you a pittance compared to other industries, but it's such a high prestige job to work for Elon Musk. They just burn through people like they're disposable. I mean, it's outrageous. You're expected to work a minimum of 100 hours. The pay is embarrassingly low, but they can turn and burn because they're SpaceX, and everyone wants to work for SpaceX. And people who actually are qualified for that kind of work are just like, this is like way beneath me in pay, and the chance, and
he exploits his workers, like the mines of gems that he grew up with, how he built his wealth, his father, in the gem mines
Well, I
of
think
South
I
Africa.
yeah, the emerald mine. Yeah. So the thing is, like, a lot of people ironically compare him to Thomas Edison, not knowing that he is in fact just like Thomas Edison, because it was people like Tesla that made all the inventions, and it was Edison that profited off of it. I mean, we still pay our checks to the Edison company. I mean, like, I pay my utility bill to the Edison company. So and people don't realize, because they don't know that Edison didn't actually invent anything,
Hmm.
and that he really was about profiting off of the people that work for him. And then they again they accidentally make the correct analogy, even though they're making it for all the wrong reasons, because they believe in the mythology of Edison and the mythology of Elon Musk and the mythology of billionaires. So
And that plays
we're
into
just
the
in a
white
very
supremacy,
childish mentality. Yeah, absolutely.
right? And
Yeah,
and
there's a ton
and
of white privilege.
and the same with this bank crisis that's going on now. So we have an article that was written earlier by Andy Kessler at the Wall Street Journal, which, by the way, like you said, is the fascist rag. It's owned by um, Rupert
Rupert
Murdoch.
Murdoch.
And the one key quote from that article, that, or it was an opinion piece, he says, was there regulatory failure? Perhaps. SVU was regulated like a bank, but looked more like a money market fund. Then there's this. In its proxy statement, SVB notes that besides 91% of their board being independent and 45% women, they also have one black, one LGBTQ plus, and two veterans. I'm not saying, which this is highlighted, I'm not saying 12 white men would have avoided this mess, but the company may have been distracted by diversity demands. So he wants to blame it on the minority group when historically white men have been the cause of all of our financial crises.
Yeah. So he literally says, I don't have any reason to believe this. I'm speculating, but can we just blame the minorities again? Because wink, wink, we know what this means. We can get all up in arms and say, oh, they should have put their priorities on such and such instead of diversity. And what he doesn't realize, and this keeps going back to the same point I'm always making on this podcast, is that we don't have actual discussions about politics, policy, anything like that. We're always talking about a person's emotional intelligence or not, right? Um, and what happens is privilege breeds pathology. And what I mean by that is, when you have privilege, you don't even know how embarrassing you sound, like a clown, like a racist clown. And what he doesn't realize is, in his own statement, he's like, I don't have any reason to believe this. There's no evidence of this, but maybe they shouldn't have worried about diversity. Even though, 99.9% of every financial collapse that's ever happened in the history of modern humanity has been, caused by white men. Let's just find a way that I can say we're afraid of diversity and we're concerned that it's distracting us. And then he doesn't point to the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is capitalism, corruption, deregulation, um, and he doesn't want to talk about how the CEO dumped stock just before the collapse. I mean, he wants to blame Why don't you blame the white man who dumped stock before
Right.
you see?
And
So in other words, he's just saying, you know what this is like? When your friend says, I don't mean to be racist, but, and then they're going to say something
and then
racist.
it's like, yeah, exactly. And then there's like, but I have a black friend, or you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Like the
Yeah, my wife is black.
hold that thought. I'm going to play this video from this young man here, and he's going to talk about the capitalism subject, and we're going to get thoughts on the other side of this video.
Something that's interesting that a lot of people don't talk about when they advocate for anti-capitalism is how bad capitalism is at placing people in a hierarchical structure of society. Every current society has an hierarchy. And although the caste system, for example, is rigid by definition, that doesn't mean that ours is very fluid or even fair. And all you have to really think about is who's going to win in a competitive game of humans. In a competitive game of humans where working is not the priority. Because rich people don't work more than poor people. They just have enough money to hire other poor people to do work for them so that they can make more money, which is exploitation, right? So in a system that allows exploitation and is competitive, who are the people that are going to rise to the top? Psychopaths and sociopaths. And we see this shit time and time again. Like, you would figure if the system was truly fair, the people that are at the top of our society would be the best people, you know? Like, these are the people that really create the future and, like, solve problems and do good things for people, but they aren't. And they're at the top of our society. Like, do you not recognize how stupid that is? Like, Elon Musk asked the UN to devise a plan to end global hunger and promised that he would pay for it if they did. They did. It cost $6 billion. He backed out. This shit happens all the fucking time. These people do not care about anybody else but themselves. And it's so blatantly obvious why they're in the position they are, because they don't care. They'll exploit anything. They'll use any weakness. And it's even more obvious when you realize how many rich people are pedophiles, right? Like, pedophilia is something that comes from the ego. It is not a natural or normal thing. It's like serial killers moving from rats to cats to people, right? If you're a rich person, you've experienced everything, you seek to desecrate nature. Especially if you're a sociopath or a psychopath, where like normal human shit doesn't really apply to you. I see this as one of the strongest arguments for anti-capitalism. Because no matter how you fucking slice it, capitalism is horrible at organizing who should have the power. It gives it to the greedy, selfish, unempathetic people that are so soulless that they would rather hoard their wealth than end any crisis in the world. Any crisis. Not even one has been solved by them. And at the same time, abuse and exploit children together. They're so fucked up that they work together on this shit. Like, how has every person met Epstein? How? Every fucking rich person. I swear to fucking God. I'm so tired of this shit. We haven't even talked about who it places at the bottom. Like, have you ever talked to a homeless person? Most of those people are fucking veterans. What? What? Did you know that 22 veterans commit suicide a day? A day. Like, what? It's fucking disgusting what this economic system does to our society and to people. It's an abomination. I don't know. I felt like I had more to say, but it's just such an obviously fucked up point that I can like barely graze over it, and you get the picture.
So we were talking about this a few weeks ago, and remember, I was comparing what he just said. He worded it in a different way to if anyone has ever seen the movie Hostel or the Squid Game. So they basically the concept of those movies are super rich people, like he said, have done everything. They've had everything handed to them. They've done everything. They have all this money that they still will never spend in their entire lifetime. So they go to doing these um, degenerate things, like in Hostel. They go to another country.
Yeah, they get to experience murder. I know.
Yeah, and then yeah.
So yeah, it's about extreme decadence. Perhaps that's part of it. I don't really want to go into that. That could very well be it, but that really is just about luxury and thrill seeking. That it's a little bit like porn addiction. When you're addicted to porn, you need more and more stimulation until the next thing you know, you're chasing violent type porn, which is becoming increasingly common. So yeah, you need more and more stimulation. So is this like addictive behavior? It looks like it. But again, for me, one thing he doesn't mention in that is that, sure, capitalism brings very pathological people to the top, but he doesn't mention the structure of it is such that the structure of capitalism itself ensures that there are a few people at the top and tons of workers below. This is something that, about 100 years ago, people understood extremely well. The average worker who was barely literate understood this extremely well. They had a very astute understanding of the structure of capitalism and how it was fundamentally wrong. I want to see a little bit more disciplined kinds of arguments. Unfortunately, those are not as sexy. I think the kinds of arguments he makes are more sexy and attractive and appealing, especially to younger people, because we live in a very Protestant society, very puritanical society, and we hate the idea that if you're rich, you get to indulge in your vices, and that disturbs us. And so that's usually a more compelling audience in terms of truthiness. I don't know if you remember that term that Colbert introduced, the idea that we don't really care about the truth or not. If it feels truthy, that's what's more important. And that means a lot. That's meaningful to point that out. It was, by the way, it was Oxford English Dictionary's word of the year for that year. They just loved that word. And rightfully so, because what it represents is the fact that time and time again, as we study the way people think, we don't think rationally or logically or factually. We think emotionally. So unfortunately, these kinds of arguments get more play and are more visceral to us because of our hyper-Protestant morality, that we hate the idea that rich people can then get access to young, teenage girls. We just hate that. It seems creepy to us and blah, 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 blah. I don't think that's the main problem with capitalism. It's a problem. It's creepy. It's weird and disturbing and whatnot. But I think it's the I don't know if you remember that summer where we had Where's the White Girl summer, where a couple of white girls went missing and the whole world was like, where's the white girl at?
Yeah.
I just feel like it's a little bit of that, like there are these young white teenage girls that are being exploited by these creepy old men. I feel like that's the big concern that everyone's so upset about. We're not talking about the hundreds of millions of little black babies, little black and brown babies that die of 100% preventable causes due to capitalism annually.
And the missing Native American
every
women.
fucking year. Sure. But what I'm saying is just preventable causes, no access to clean water being the primary one, simply because poor people cannot get access to clean water. They're dying by the hundreds of 100 million every fucking year. So that, to me, that's just such a bigger problem that we should be talking about. And he's talking about the empathy gap. Again, our empathy gap is we get really compelled when a young innocent white girl gets exploited. I mean, there's something deeply visceral about how much we as a society just, we're going to wear stickers commemorating.
Well, that's what the
wear
media
an
tries to
armband
push on everybody too.
missing white girl.
The media
sure.
pushes that.
But it's visceral.
Right.
I'm telling you. Dave Chappelle's or it was Chris Rock or Dave Chappelle's old joke, that whenever there's a plane hijacking, all the black people breathe a sigh of relief because black people make the worst hostages. Like, we have this black guy, we're going to kill. What? Hello? Yeah, he's like, we are going to kill this black guy. Hello. They don't make good hostages. So again, if you want a good hostage, make sure it's a white blonde girl.
Well, and also to add to that as well, like, you remember I actually was making a joke about kind of like that to somebody too when we were discussing Hostel. I was like, well, you know what? Realistically, when you think about it, they showed like all white people in there. So all these foreign rich people were in the market of buying all these white people. So say a black person goes over to one of these countries, they're safe because they don't want their passports. They don't, which is kind of
I felt like Hostel was the trope of the Eastern European girl. So we get our word slave from Slav,
right?
And no matter what Slavic people will tell you, oh, that's a myth, that's in fact a misnomer. You can go ahead and ask them, oh, okay, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Tell me how I'm wrong. They'll tell you, dictionaries are oppressive and this and like, okay. So tell me why our word slave doesn't come from Slav.
So you would have been,
because it literally does. Our word slave comes from Slav because from time immemorial, since from before history was written in Europe, Slavs, Eastern Europeans have always been the fodder for people and tribes west of them, whether there was Romans, Franks, Germans, you name it. They always would just pick on Eastern Europeans. They were always lesser than. They were always less organized, less violent, whatever it was, and they were always using them and raiding them and stealing and robbing and pillaging, and then that goes right into the current era with during the Iraq War and Afghanistan. You remember at that time they were called Blackwater, and then they changed their name about 10 more times because they were so notorious. But these mercenary armies they called them contractors.
Right.
A contractor is somebody that builds a house for you. A person that goes and kills for you for money is called a mercenary. So for them to call that contractor was Orwellian. But these contractors, they were getting notoriously were running a side brothel where they had these Eastern European girls. And again, the importance of Eastern European girls is they're, tall, skinny, blonde, just exactly the ideal type that our current modern dominant society desires. And the whole news story that came out at the time was you could get dollar blowjobs from these Eastern European girls that were trafficked by Blackwater, a Christian organization. Eric Prince is very, very Christian and very evangelical.
And Peter
So
Thiel.
It's not an accident. What?
Peter Thiel. He's also the cause of this banking crisis. From
he's super Christian.
Well, he I don't know about super Christian, but hold on just a second.
And also
really quick, hold on. Let me see here.